episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey everybody, welcome once again. We're back. This is 2 weeks in a row. I think it's even less than a week apart. So I guess we're kind of back on our schedule. We're very glad to have Ernest Mueller joining us today, and we have other guests lined up. Obviously, all the discussion last week with Kevin Cody on Cores was excellent. Go check out that podcast if you didn't see it. Ken and I, however, next week, if we do a podcast, it's going to be remote from Melbourne, of all places.
They actually reached out, by the way, Seth, and said that I think it was Daniel Ting. He reached out and said that we can use a room there to podcast from.
Cool. So so maybe we'll do something at least on Friday during the conference for hour and talk about what we're doing down there and the AppSec Day conference. It's a pretty impressive one. We always talk about the fact that the developer community comes out to that security conference, right? Most of the time we go to these application security conferences like the OWASP AppSec conferences or whatever else. It feels very security heavy, like a lot of product security people and penetration testers like web app, whatever, and a few developers. But I can't remember what the percentage Julian said last year, Ken was, but it was something like 70% of their attendees were developers and not security people. So it felt very much more like those developer conferences we go to, like the PyCons and CodeMash or whatever else. So it was kind of it's a cool one. If you can make it to Australia in October, it's not necessarily the easiest one to get to, but anybody that's down there in Australia, hello, we'll be down, hit us up and we'll go grab a drink or dinner or something because we're excited to be
By
there.
my calculations and my understanding of time zones, it's like the year 2022 there.
Something like that. No, okay. So this was the other thing I figured out because no, never mind. I'm not going to say that because it gives out too much personal information. Never mind.
All right.
It has to do with my birthday and flying and anyway, it doesn't matter. So anyway, so we have Ernest on the show today.
Howdy. Some of the folks in our startup are in Melbourne, so I'll try to send them out.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, the conference isn't too expensive, but it's a great little. Julian does a great job. I think they're expecting probably 800 plus this year. They had over 600 last year. Yeah, it's a good conference. So.
I think it's going to be Friday of next week, but then it would be. Oh my God! I'm gonna have a stroke trying to figure out what time. So I think it would be a Thursday US and then Friday. Yeah. Okay, all right. Again, don't understand time zones at all.
Just take our time and add 18 hours or something to it. Crazy like that. So it's going to the future. Don't worry about it.
Right. But then you go back into the past, coming back to the States. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my flight leaves Melbourne, and then I get back home like an hour after I left, but I traveled for 24 hours or something like that. So
it's insane.
So
it is insane.
But we're giving our course. I'm actually going to do a short hour on the secure code review framework as well during the conference. See how much I can slam into an hour. Because that's always a challenge. So anyway, so that's what we've got going on. Other than that, I do have Cactus Con on the calendar. That's the beginning of December. I don't know if anybody else is I think Ken's about done traveling for the year. He's been on the road a lot. So find us online. We'll definitely be there. So. Anyway, so that's everything that I had. Let's talk about Ernest.
Howdy.
Oh, howdy. Ernest, Ken, did you have an intro script that you pulled up for Ernest?
Yeah, no. So first of all, Ernest has spoken a bunch. I mean, the last time I saw you speak was at LastCon. I think I was in the first row, watching you. You're a really good speaker was the first takeaway. And the second takeaway is that you've been, you've basically been working with not just web apps, but just like, because we talk obviously absolute AppSec, but just systems engineering in general. A lot of the nuts and bolts of operations you've worked in. You used to work for Alien Vault, and I just I really enjoyed. I've always enjoyed your talks. Like I said, you're a really good speaker, and I think you have a lot to offer, especially when we talk about I don't know what people want to call it, DevOps Sec, DevSecOps, whatever it is that you want to call it, but the real idea of DevOps and how security plays into DevOps, and then also you have a fair bit of experience with Agile and Lean and that whole sort of process. And I just think there's a lot for you to offer folks on this podcast. So we wanted to have you on, and I'm glad you joined. Thanks for joining us today.
Great. Absolutely. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah. So Seth, before we get into it, I want to hear a little bit about Ernest's background, because if you look at your background, it spans quite a bit, right?
I'm old.
No, I didn't mean it like that, but you've definitely done so you've been was that product manager at, I don't know how to say this, Idea Software?
Yes, Idea.
And you were presumably this is where maybe you met James and Karthik, was at National Instruments as a web systems architect?
That's right.
Sweet.
Yeah. So I'll give you the quick view. I'm perhaps different from some of the folks you have on in that, I've never really been a full-time security person, but just because of my background, security has always been about 20% of my day, whatever role it is I've been in, right? So I originally graduated in electrical engineering from Rice University back in the 90s. And my first job was with FedEx corporate IT, where I did, development, systems administration. Me and another guy wrote the first international version of the internet ship, the go ship your packages on the FedEx website, right?
Oh, nice.
I just back in the day, CGI scripts for the win.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah. And even during that point, as somebody who was also doing kind of systems administration work, back then, security was your job, right? We had some data protection department far away, right? But at that time, it's just like Cliff Stall, right? From the famous The Cuckoo's Egg. It's you're the system administrator, you're the person that sees what's going on. So I got good with kind of the security tooling of the day, the cops, the crack, the Satan, that generation of tooling, and it was just part of what you did as a responsible system administrator. And then, of course, as web applications became more and more prominent, you obviously had to make sure you were hardening your applications. Security was obviously very infrastructure focused up until that point. But the second that you got web apps, kind of the application security started to become the more important part of that equation. Left there during the...
That was a weird transition. That was a weird transition, to AppSec being a thing, because it was so heavily network security, and it just that
Absolutely.
Whole transition to there's more than just our firewall to be concerned about now. That was a whole, people don't realize, but that was a big deal.
Absolutely. In fact, the reason that I kind of shifted my career to be web focused, right? I was sitting there at FedEx. I loaded up, the Nixa HTTP daemon version 0.9, whatever it was, right? And some other guy, FedEx had a big TCP/IP network, right? But it was all being used for weird stuff, right? But some other guy somewhere else brought one up, and using Mosaic, I could, go hit his side and he could hit mine. And I was like, it was one of those oh shit moments that you have in your career, and you're like, oh, okay, I see I see how this is going to be, right? It's so obviously more powerful than the kind of computing paradigms that came behind it, but definitely came with its whole new set of problems. But back then, if you were doing it, you were doing all of it. You were writing the CGI scripts and running the web server. As I was webmaster, right? Like back when one person could do sling the HTML and run the servers, and those youthful days we were jumping in swimming holes or whatever. But from there, worked for a kind of print and internet publishing startup in Memphis during the first .com boom, which of course went out of business at the end of the first .com boom in 2000. Sorry.
We've all worked at places like that where they just they don't exist anymore. Living social.
Yep. So found myself in the Northeast for a little while, and then I'm from Texas originally, and got an opportunity with National Instruments to come back down here and run the web systems team out there. And that was 16 years ago, something like that. And that's when I met James Wickett and Josh Sokol and Karthik Gaikwad and Pekko Karyanev and all those folks. All the systems ones were on my team, and then Karthik and the developers were kind of our partners in the application development group. And at National Instruments at the time, there was no and this is weird because it was a big company, there was no full-time security staff of any sort. Right?
Wow.
The rumor was they had one, but found him sleeping in his cube too much and got rid of him or something. Random scuttlebutt, right? That I can't vouch for, but there was just nobody. So as the systems team, it kind of naturally devolved to us, and we were always looking to expand what we were doing. So we added on practice areas in APM, and we added on a practice area in security, and we're like, okay, well, we'll start helping with this. And two of my guys, James and Josh, they were both real early career at that point. They were like, security, we're interested in that. What do we do? And I was like, well, I had a letter published in 2600 magazine back in the day. Let's get y'all into security, figure out what's going on. And we plugged into OWASP. There was a somewhat defunct Austin OWASP chapter at that point. And so we started holding meetings. There were some other folks with the Whole Foods at the time that were interested. So we started having meetings and flipping back and forth between the venues until we figured out that flipping back and forth caused nobody to show up. And so we started having them at National Instruments, and to this day now, more than a decade later, they're still having, big old Austin OWASP meetings over at National Instruments and going strong, right? So that was awesome. So we got plugged into it from that perspective, learned a lot more. That was when we also came into contact with DevOps super early. And I feel like this is instructive because with the discussion about DevSecOps and all that right now. So the way that I had done development in the past, but I was primarily managing an operations team, right? And I had a lot, just out of sheer luck and good hiring, I guess, had a bunch of sharp people, right? It was a company that hires all engineers. The average employee of National Instruments is an electrical engineer, mechanical engineer, whatever, very, very cerebral place, right? So we really were trying to push the envelope on just how well we were doing things. It's like, hey, operations, it's important. We're putting millions of dollars through our web store. We're doing all this stuff. How do we make this better and better? And after a while, it became clear that we were banging our heads against a wall somehow, right? Like, we're using all the best tools we can get. We were really putting a lot of thought into it. We were doing the right things, but the systems team was still always the bottleneck, right? Like, I got it to where we were a valued partner. There'd be like the web business meeting, and the app developer managers would come, and I would come, and like everybody's like, oh, we love them and they're great, but like they're still the bottleneck in what's going on. We still can't get our new projects out fast enough. We still can't whatever. And we were going to the Velocity conferences, which were kind of the first kind of O'Reilly sysadmin oriented conferences. They're still going on today. They're kind of half sysadmin, half web performance. But before that, you just had to go to other conferences and bottom feed to get any sort of operations stuff. Like, I guess I'll go to the one, the one talk that said all about operational topics. So O'Reilly really stepped in there. I think Tim O'Reilly and folks like Jesse Robbins had clear visions around the importance of operations early on. So we started doing that, and when kind of DevOps hit, because we were just kind of already in those things and talking with those people and seeing the Facebook 10 deploys a day and the DevOps love presentation, like some of those real seminal things, we were already kind of really primed for it and saying, like we're putting so much effort into this and doing it so well and still having it not bear fruit. Like you clearly got the impression that you must be swimming against the current somehow. Like it's like there's something fundamentally wrong that's making us not be successful, besides, because we're smart, motivated, planning, have good tools, like we've got support. Like it's not, you can't point at anything and blame it anymore. It's just not happening. And then, when DevOps hit and we were, talking with all those folks and realizing, yeah, maybe that crazy agile stuff the developers are doing could be brought to bear on this, and maybe, not having 10 different teams broken down by infrastructure specialty, like maybe that's terrible. Maybe that's causing some of the problem, right? And so they started up a SaaS organization at National Instruments, and they tapped some of us to come over and help lead it, because we were in IT, right? We're running the corporate website and web store and all that. But in the product division, they were like, we need to start doing this. And so we went over there and we all looked at each other and we're like, okay, like, let's try this. We're gonna do it all in the cloud. We're going to have an integrated developer and ops team. We're gonna really try this new approach. And I mean, in the end, it worked out beautifully. I mean, the average time to deliver a new product in the normal National Instruments pipeline is 3 years, and for us, it was 1 year.
How often were you doing what was before the progress was made? How often were deploys done? With like on average. I mean, you had mentioned Facebook at that time was doing like 10 deploys a day, which is actually a pretty big deal back in this time frame. But yeah.
So that was an interesting point of contention, right? In the web systems organization there. They kind of wallowed back and forth. Like we were doing these monthly deployments, and as the team grew, like they were just they were horrible, right? So we would start on a Friday night, the entire systems team, and then like we learned that stuff would go wrong and you had to have the developers around. So on chat, you would get the systems team and dozens of developers. You would start at like 8 p.m. Friday night, and you would go until you were done. And that was the wee hours, sometimes the not so wee hours on Saturday. You'd, be deploying over time 20, 30, 40 applications all at once, right? Geez. And it started getting worse and worse. And this is before kind of the CI/CD book had come out.
Yeah, I was just thinking, how much of it works on my machine did you guys have to deal with
all of it?
But here's the funny thing: we made these like just larval steps towards it. Like my friend Pekka, we had him write this thing we called auto deploys, because people would just put in a ticket. They would say, deploy my Java application. Here's some poorly thought out things to type, right?
Yeah.
Nightmare. So we wrote this little Perl thing, and we were like, tell you what, here's your config file, right? Tell us where in Perforce, because this is before Git, right? I'm old, right?
Right.
Tell us where your jar is and what other files need to be moved and whatever. And don't tell us, put it in that, run it on test, and then we'll run it on production. And of course, right before we implemented that, there was no end of whining, right? For the developers, like, what? Blah, 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 right? But then we did one release with it, and we never heard a peep out of anybody else again, because it just became clear how much better it made their lives.
Oh, nice.
Because we were making their happy asses stay up all night on Friday night as well, right? And so they're like, oh, if I do this and my deployment works in a production-like environment, and then they run it, like, it's better for everybody, right? So we had done some stuff like that, but we weren't thinking of things in a CI sort of perspective, just because we didn't have that lens to put to it. But I still remember with the app director came over, and he was like, oh boy, these monthly releases are terrible. And we're like, yeah. And he was like, well, maybe we should do what we do with the ERP systems and move to quarterly releases, right? And
slow it down.
And my heart just turned over. And at the time, I couldn't even, you didn't have the language, small batch size, whatever. You didn't have the language to say why that was wrong. But like, I was like, that, like, like I seriously am considering choking you out and throwing you in a dumpster somewhere. Like there's something so wrong about that, because it's just, it'll be worse. It'll be not linearly worse. Right.
Right.
Exactly. And so that's, again, this is all pre-DevOps, but this is what got our minds going. Right. I see a lot of that having gone on in InfoSec. Right. There were at an OWASP meeting, and boy, I don't even know how long ago this is now, 7 years. Andre Gironda came, and he did a talk coming and integrating with teams. Like, I come in as a pen tester, and like, he's like, I discovered people don't really like being audited or tested, but they like having a security buddy. So I would come in and be their security buddy, right? And and I was like, ooh, that sounds like security is starting to grasp out towards those same sort of concepts that we had just started, or 3 years into in DevOps or whatever. So I've been seeing that same sort of kind of baseline setting going on. And so just to quickly skip to the end there's still the introduction. Like,
no. So actually, I was going to mention, like, if you've never met Andre, like Gironda is how I'd say it, so what I like about Andre is that, first of all, like, he's probably one of the people that, I mean, I don't know what else he does besides security, honestly, because I can't imagine there's anything else. He's like really super read up and is constantly keeping up with things for like at least over a decade now that I've known of Andre. And also really nice person, however, very honest. And that's not always well received from folks. But if you know Andre, it's not like he's trying to be malicious or anything like that. It's just that he's just a very blunt person and very like honest, and definitely like is not going to shy away from the hard truths. So anyways, I Seth, I don't know if you met him, but I love the guy.
No, he's great.
Very honest.
Like when he came and gave that talk, I went up to him. I was like, hey, like, really like what you're doing there. And so then, again, I float in and out of the security sphere. So did that at National Instruments, and then I guess we shipped about 3 different products, and then all of us were like, time for our next challenge. So we all kind of scattered to the winds. Folks like James decided to go into more of a security focused thing full time, and then I went. I decided to try my hand at product management. Well, actually, first I went to Bizarre Voice. They had moved to Agile, and they had like a 6-week release cycle, and they tried to just start releasing at the end of each sprint, and it all came tumbling down and went terribly. And they were like, oh, like I guess there's more stuff we actually have to do to be able to do that. So I was specifically hired in initially as release manager, basically get us down to 2-week releases. So we kind of went through the CI/CD playbook, automated testing, getting people comfortable with signing off and with saying something's not ready to go. We got the releases down to 2 weeks, and then we got them down to 1 week. We never got to kind of full continuous delivery. We do continuous integration to kind of our test environments, but it was a very mature system with a lot of integration. So keeping to that weekly cadence for other people to uptake, go into production was useful for us. There were a bunch of other systems that let you make production changes to like customer integrations and stuff on a as you need basis. So we got to a week, and then we were real happy. And so then I took over the ops team there. And then one of the great things about Bizarre Voice, and it was super refreshing because prior to that, I'd worked for pretty large organizations. I mean, obviously FedEx is crazy large, and National Instruments is pretty large. But there, if everybody looked at each other and decided the right thing to do is X, they would just be like, hey, everybody, next Monday, we're going to be doing X. Like there wasn't all like a lot of places like find it hard to believe that it really is as simple as that. It really is as simple as that. So I took over the ops team, and we did that for a while. And then I was like, I think the right thing to do is to not have an ops team anymore. We should embed the engineers in the individual teams and stuff like that. And so, we were like, we declared the death of the ops team. Like 2 of them are going to that team, and then 1 to that team, and whatever. And they'll still kind of report back, but they'll be kind of permanently embedded.
Is this an evolution based off of that, like that concept of a buddy, basically? I mean, I know it was a security context, but
yes,
I don't know if that helps.
In terms of a lot of the goals of Agile and Lean, right? You want to have a product team that has everything they need to go from, in Agile, they always say from concept to, or Lean, they always say from concept to cash, right? It's like, you've got the idea. Do you have the resources you need to create that and ship it and whatever without having to go ask some other team? Because whenever you ask some other team, you get that standard kind of map theory, geometric blocking sort of thing going on. Whereas if one team if they can, do the requirements and develop it and test it and build the infrastructure and ship it to production, all integral to themselves, then they can achieve really, really high rates of speed because there's no artificial blocking on other teams. To jump back in time, I'll tell you a little anecdote from National Instruments that was very affecting to me when I was first starting to think about these ideas. So pre-cloud, again, because I'm super old, right? Virtualization, VMware came around, right? So at that time, we had an IT infrastructure division where we were web systems. There was a Unix team, a network team, a storage team, a data center team, a Windows team, a collaboration. Like there were like 12 damn teams, right? DBA team. So for us to get a new server for web systems, it took 6 weeks, right?
Oh, wow.
It would be like, here, this is what we need. The Unix admins would vet the specs. They'd put in an order with Dell. Dell would ship it to us. One team would rack it and jack it. Another team would load the OS on it. 6 weeks, right? So VMware comes in and they're like, hey, we got this cool thing. Look, click, and 15 minutes later, you've got a new server, right? And everybody's like, that's badass. Management's like, that sounds great. So, we buy a big, VM farm. We get a new VM team because why not, right? And then guess how long it took me to get a new server?
6 weeks.
So 4 weeks. The 2 weeks of Dell fulfillment were removed.
Oh, right? Yeah.
But like it suddenly became very like, that's one of those oh shit moments, right? You're like, okay, like this is something that it takes 15 minutes, but my organization's process is turning that into 4 weeks. And this is before I had learned anything about lean and stuff like that. So like if you learn about lean, like you start understanding why that is, and you can kind of put terminology around it. But like at the time, I just kind of had that realization. I was like, we're doing like we are generating the friction, right? Like it's not some external factor causing it to be this slow. We're making it this slow. Like we're turning 15 minutes into 4 weeks. That's inherently wrong, right? And if you can make that realization, right, like it's not too long before business decision makers start to make that same realization, right? They're like, hey, we bought this thing with the whole 15-minute thing. I'm trying to get this new project out. Why is the systems team still telling me that it's a month before I can even have dev servers to do things on? Like, what's wrong here? Like, I'm not getting the business value that I believe I should be getting, right?
Yeah, you're paying for, right? That you're investing time and money in.
And so, like, either you can adapt to that, or you can you can get some adaptation put down upon you by business decision makers, and that's usually unpleasant. Sorry, my cat is freaking.
No.
I don't know why.
Yeah, my cat does the same thing. It's happened on this podcast several times. Don't feel bad.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, I mean, the stories that you're telling her is that like they resonate. I mean, like I'm an old guy too, right? That's there's a few of us around, but I spent my early days at iOmega, right? At kind of their height when they had a few thousand employees, and what you're saying is almost absolutely right. They were a bit more progressive just because they had a startup feel to them. But I totally remember, turning around and trying to get a new system in, and even like AMD comes out with something that's new, and you're like, oh, sweet, this is going to like increase our performance and help us do X, Y, and Z. And it's 3 months before we actually could see any hardware, right? Or have anything in place to actually use and it was mostly because it had to go through, it has to go through, the Unix administrators. It's got to go through the network admin. Somebody has to rack it. It has to go through receiving, sits there for a couple of days, right? It was this whole kind of process of deploying a server. And it wasn't necessarily that the people weren't smart enough to do it quicker. It was just, hey, guess what, right? Like most people have like a daily cadence, and this is what they do, and they're only deploying things once a week, and then on top of everything else that's going along. I mean, you talk about Perl, and I feel like that's where, like at National, like where you were before, that was the glue back then, right?
Absolutely. Python or whatever, but back then, Perl was the
king, right? And
if you were doing apps, it was C, and if you were doing admin stuff, it was Perl. It's like Java and Python, maybe not today, but 5 years ago.
Yeah, but because I wonder how many of us wrote some of those pre-DevOps tools, because that was realistically, because I did Java development initially, and then moved on to like the system administration team to basically build a system that did deployment to like a continuous integration deployment, so that I could actually pull the code out of CVS right back then, right? This is like how far back I'm going before Subversion, and actually like bundle it up, actually run Java C and build your jar, and then deploy it to Blue Martini at the time, and then we started to use like Tomcat and some of the other ones as they were coming out. But it was this huge process, and I just wonder how much of that got tied up, right? Had we shared some of that Perl code across the industry, it probably would have helped things out, right?
Well, that's a good point, right? Like not just pre-internet, but like, you got internet, and then you have the rise of sharing, right? The reason a lot of the newer, Perl had CPAN, right? But one of the key factors of success of all these newer programming languages and or tools and ecosystems like your Chefs and your Terraforms or whatever has largely to do with how they manage code sharing, right? Like, can somebody make a module for deploying an Apache server and then nobody else has to ever do that again? Like that's actually behind, like, people, when new programming languages come out, people love to talk about, frankly, weird esoteric crap about them, that's going to be why they're successful or not. That's not why they're successful or not. They're successful if a developer can go suddenly download 200 libraries to do the stuff they need to do. Like, period, end of story. Like, I would go so far as to say that is the only significant factor in the success of a programming language nowadays, because it's so important, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, we talk about Node, right, and how popular it is, and part of that is NPM, right, or probably the majority of it, right? I mean, honestly, 97% of an application is not custom code anymore. It's just all the modules that get pulled down. So,
absolutely, yeah. I mean, my new gig, Precision Autonomy, is a startup, and we're 100% serverless, and it's all Angular and Node, and it's like, okay, we need to generate PDFs. Great, let's go look for an NPM package that's going to do that. We need to do this other thing, like the writing it yourself should always be your last resort, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing in operations. We learned, like, I still think everybody doesn't really fully embrace this for historical reasons, but you always see the little pyramid, like SaaS, infrastructure as a service, platform in between, and all that stuff. And really, the thing that makes logical sense nowadays is, if nobody has to write it, if you could just buy it as a SaaS service or something, and it does what you need it to do, that is always the most efficient. Some platforms, the service play where, you have to write some code, but you don't have to do the infrastructure. That's your fallback. Then, doing it cloud infrastructure, that's your next fallback. Doing it on-premise infrastructure, that's your next fallback. And you should only ever traverse down that pyramid if there is a super compelling reason, like you just cannot do what you need to do at that level of kind of doing less of that work, right? And so that's why our new thing, we're like, okay, like, now that we have Lambdas and stuff like that, like, do we have any challenges that actually require servers? No. Therefore, we shouldn't, like, any time that I were to waste, putting servers together, making sure that they're, up to the CIS benchmarks, doing all, like, it's all waste. Right. Yeah. And that's a big concept in Lean, right? Identifying what of your work is creating value in a product and what of it is cost of doing business, waste, stuff that in the perfect world you wouldn't have to do, and then you could get the value for less investment. And serverless is a great tool in that toolbox. Now, I can definitely look down the path and say, okay, there are some things that we would need to do that would require us to do something other than serverless. But, like, we're certainly not going to do them until we're forced down that path. Or time is money when you're a startup, right? You're burning funding. So every 15 minutes you spend screwing around on something that isn't actually necessary for your mission is a nail in the coffin of your organization.
And it's a little bit more common now, like serverless, but I remember James Wickett coming to OWASP Nova, and he was doing like a lot of us do, where we like go to a local meetup, do the talk, refine it, before it goes to like a big stage. So he was doing that. And I remember like a good portion of his talk was just on like, what is serverless? Because it had to be, because it was just so new, even just a few years ago, that, he just kind of had to lay out like, okay, here's what it is, before getting into like how it can work for you, against you, etc. Like, explaining what it was.
Yeah,
was a big deal.
Things, before that, the whole pass thing, I frequently would say that whenever somebody comes in and tries to sell somebody on a pass, like, people would just look at them, it's like they're a sorcerer or something. Like, it was, it violated kind of existing paradigms of how people thought about computing. And so it was very, it was hard, even though in most cases, people are essentially generating their own platform as a service internally, right? Because they're like, wait, this is inefficient. We need, our Java auto deploys that we wrote back in the day, like, that's a first step towards building a platform for people to use. So it does kind of make sense to use a commodity one instead of doing your own. But it's a hard conceptual step for people. In tech and in security and whatever, there are always those things that, like, they're not a bigger technical leap, but they're a bigger conceptual leap, just for whatever dint of history in human psychology, right?
Yep.
But yeah, so from Bizarre Voice, so we disintegrated the ops team, embedded them everywhere. We had a very small security and compliance team. It was like 2 people. There was the lady kind of doing the compliance, and then the guy she hired to do the security. And so we became kind of the natural liaison for them to kind of, gateway that into the teams. And so that was really good, kind of working with them, because we, just like everybody nowadays, that was my first experience in having to go through the whole list of compliances. I mean, at National Instruments, we had to do ISO and we did PCI and stuff like that. But Bizarre Voice was the first one where it's like, here's the list of 200 weird international compliance regimes, and we have to tick all of them, right? Or, we can't sell in France if we don't do whatever that weird one that starts with F is. And it's like, okay, right. And doing that in an efficient and kind of integrated with engineering teams manner. That was kind of the first, like, we had done security with our DevOps team at National Instruments, but this was the first time that I was kind of doing it on a larger scale. Like, I was managing 4 teams, and there was another dozen teams in the engineering department. Like, I didn't work myself out of a job, right? We disintegrated the ops team, and they were like, here's a product team, go do them. I was like, okay. So that was very interesting. And then I took a little bit of a side detour. I wanted to move into product management. My friend Pecco had done that with Riverbed, and he really enjoyed that. And I felt like I had kind of become expert enough, especially in the DevOps kind of monitoring and stuff like that. I was like, I'd kind of like to be able to call the shots on something in that domain. So I went to a startup called Copper Egg here in Austin that was a SaaS monitoring provider. They got bought by a company called Idera that does. They were doing primarily SQL Server tools. They've bought another probably dozen companies since then, so they do a bunch of stuff. But was there about a year. When they got bought out, it's funny, when they got bought out, they got rid of all the engineers.
No.
I wasn't an engineer, so they didn't get rid of me, right? Manager, you stay. You need to write things and send them off to foreign countries. And, all right.
Oh no.
Well, and that was a real interesting experience as well, because I had kind of moved into SaaS, and like I had been doing it long enough that like I had forgotten there are people that don't understand it, right? So these guys, they bought a SaaS company and they fired all the engineers, and I was like, so hey, like you actually have to have people tending to this thing. It doesn't. And like, to their credit, they buy a lot of companies that are underwater financially, and they're like, yes,
Right.
everyone always tells us they need all that shit that's driving them out of business, whatever,
Yeah.
right? But unfortunately, then products starting to go down. My boss and PM was like, you do not put your hands on that. It's not our problem. I'm like, okay, right. And so unfortunately that product took a lot of beating, because there were day-long outages, right? That until they were finally like, oh, okay, yeah, let's bring in a team that'll do kind of the care and feeding, right? But that was something where I realized, like, I've kind of developed a passion for education stuff over time, because whenever we learn something, especially after a while, we just assume everybody knows that. And it's almost always incorrect assumption, right? And a lot of whatever your job is, a lot of your job has to be education. It just has to be, or else you won't be successful, right? If you're a developer, you're educating a fellow dev on what you did. If you're in security, you're educating somebody on why this finding's important. Like that is such an important part of what's going on. And kind of, I started to realize that there, and that led me into then kind of doing a lot of those LinkedIn Learning DevOps courses and stuff like that. Because I'm like, like all the DevOps Illuminati has already kind of moved on, right? Like the people that started it, they're like, oh, DevOps, that's not hip anymore. We say hipper things here, but it's like, hey, there are still huge organizations struggling with it, struggling to understand it. You can't just point them at a couple conference presentations from, 10 years ago and expect them to suddenly get it, right? Like, it's great, you got it, I got it. Like, we're smart, but like, us being smart doesn't help anything, right? Unless you can apply that to organizations and help them learn. And I think that's one of the most acute challenges with InfoSec as well, right? Like, it's over the years it grew increasingly siloed, right? For a variety of reasons. It's no one person's fault, but I mean, that, to be honest, that's why I stopped doing a lot of stuff with OWASP, right? So we were doing the OWASP thing, and I kept trying to get our developers to come attend, and I was like, hey, so I know that we're having it here at the building, and I notice you haven't come the last 3 times. What's up, right? And they'd say something along the lines of, well, it's fine. I go there, and maybe somebody will show a cool exploit or something, but I never see anything that has anything to do with my actual job of building things.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned that early in the pod, or was it during the podcast or during the pre-podcast?
Somewhere in there.
I remember.
It's a pretty common thread. I mean, for us, when we're dealing with developers, right? Like that was like why I was, talking AppSec Day and how like that's so like code relevant. But I'm with you on like the industry as a whole, right? You look at Black Hat, and you look at like how much of that is actually relevant to even like a system administrator or a developer or a business person, like their day-to-day life, and it's just not, right? Like we have this discussion all the time about it. Yeah.
I mean, at least this last year. So I went to RSA to talk at the DevSecOps Days thing there,
and you kind of semi-attached to the conference, and like at the same time. I mean,
Yes, yeah. It like happens during the first day, and then there was a DevSecOps track actually at RSA this year, which was like cool and interesting, and started bringing some of that in. But it's tough. I mean, it's the same problem that I mentioned about kind of conferences back in the day with operations, right? There were no operations conferences, and then there was an operations conference, and it could have I mean, there were operations conferences before that, like Lisa and stuff, but again, heavily siloed, right?
Yeah.
After a while, not back in the day. Like when I got started, there wasn't this kind of artificial distinction between dev and ops at that time, right? You had Unix systems programmers, right? Like you had people who knew how to use all the system calls when they were doing their C code, but like it wouldn't, when things grow, there's always specialization, right? It's when that specialization leads to siloing that it can become harmful, if not channeled right. So that's kind of what happened with us. It's like, I know the devs really wanted to go to OWASP anymore. It was for product people and pen testers, right? Like those are the people that were there. And so even I, as a manager, I'm like, okay, I need security projects or products, and I'm interested in some pen testing. But yeah, it spoke to a lower and lower percentage of the job I was doing. Right.
Well, you mentioned training and outreach, and my question really is like, in terms of developers being, and you're talking about developers' jobs, sort of. I don't know if it's. Yeah, I would say a little bit changing if you're deploying, right? If you're actually deploying operationally applications via config files or whatever, like how do you, because Chris Gates and I gave some series of talks on like DevOps security issues that have like come up. And what we found was it was a lot of like developers who were trying to play operation, have like the full networking TCP OSI layer stacked down, right? So we ran into like most of the time when we ran into this stuff, it was because somebody didn't really fully understand like the full, like I said, networking OSI, however you want to look at it or label it.
And that's one of the toughest things, right? So that's siloed organizations are the simple, easy answer to having multiple disciplines, right? It's like, well, obviously, we have network engineers, we'll put them in a big network bag. We have security people, put them in a security bag. Like it's kind of the thing that doesn't require any additional thought, because you have to have that specialization. Like sometimes DevOps gets accused of demanding everybody be a full stack engineer or whatever. And I mean, some places do fall into that trap, right? But you can't hire more than a couple of those types of engineer, right? I mean, I've only known less than 10 people that I would consider to be a adequately skilled in every layer of the stack, full stack engineer in my career, right? Instead, you have to piece together kind of the different specialties in a way where they can combine and fill in those gaps. It's like you need somebody that understands that operational level better. You need somebody you need somebody that understands the security part, but you need them to be pulling together as part of the same product team instead of being somebody that you're submitting a request to that's going to sit for 2 weeks. Because like right, wrong, or indifferent, that realization I had about the 15 minutes to make a server, business decision makers have come to that realization too. They're like, hey, all this stuff our IT department told us about, it's going to take a year to do that. Like, no, screw them, fire them, and hire somebody else. Like, the answer can always be faster than that now, right? So, like, it's not a decision you have to be slower. Like that is something that will get the decision taken out of your hands. So the question is, how do we make it fast, right? Good and fast. And the good news is, like, as we discovered in DevOps with continuous integration and stuff like that, making it faster actually made it provably better, right? It's like, well, if you don't do a big waterfall and do extensive testing, then you'll have more bugs in production or whatever. And like, that's been disproven by research over the course of doing this. It's like, no, doing them and being able to fix bugs more quickly and whatever actually has a net positive effect. So it's possible, right? But you have to kind of embrace it and try it to get the benefits. So after product management, I came. I went to Alien Vault, which was interesting because it was my first time working for an actual security company, right? And then now they're AT&T cybersecurity because we got bought, right? But we had a incubation team here in Austin. The company was originally Spanish. It was a Madrid-based startup that had done they had done OSIM, and then they productized it and made an appliance and stuff like that. And then the guys who sold Fortify to HP were wandering around with a bunch of money in their pockets. They were like, that company, right? So they got in on Alien Vault and started a incubation team over here, and very quickly came to the determination, hey, it should probably be SaaS. And we're like, that, like, it's funny. I remember the CTO, like, he came and like to the engineering team and, you know, was selling us on why it's like, it really should be SaaS because of these reasons. And, you know, we were just like, well, obviously we were wondering why y'all hadn't smartened up, right? Like,
like don't have to convince us.
Yeah, it's like you don't have to sell us. Go back to your execing, and we're gonna start writing some code. Right? And so we got that and shipped out USM Anywhere, which was very successful, and then that led AT&T to procure the company. And so that was great because we had a bunch of, you know, obviously we had to do a bunch of compliance and security stuff as well as we were making a security product. We got to dog food our own product, which was very helpful. So, you know, I still wasn't like my job wasn't full-time security. It was running the engineering operations team, but it got me a lot deeper into the modern aspect of that world, because a lot of my knowledge was a little older. I wasn't up on kind of the modern kind of threat intelligence stuff and all that. So it was great to get that. Like it's funny. I did a CISSP class. When was it? I was probably still at National Instruments. Like, I did a CISSP class, and then once it was over, I decided not to take the exam because I was kind of like, bah. Right? It's like if I have to answer a question about the Orange Book or whatever, like, whatever, right? Like, again, nothing, it's like that had nothing to do with the work I do.
10 base 2 networks, right? Like, that was on my CISP.
You're kind of making me think a lot about like the weird thing from this conversation is I'm starting to think a little bit more about like how developers have more and more on their plate. Like, it was okay to just write like a crappy, well, I shouldn't say crappy, that's opinionated. I should say a simple Java app. And then you just hand it to somebody else and they make it work. And then if it gets hacked, it's like, well, or if you need it secured, that's maybe somebody else's job. And now you're saying you're an engineer, and that's a distinction too, not like a developer only. It's an engineer now, which is like you have the ability to deploy some stuff. You have to write the code. You have to make sure it runs like on people's machines as well as, you know, when it's deployed. You have to make sure it's secure. So you're going to take security training, and you have to make sure it falls under compliance, like GDPR requirements, for instance. Like the actual burden, now that we're talking about it, and it's weird. I have never thought about it until today. Like the burden is getting, I almost feels like the burden's becoming, you know, more and more for an engineer or developer, whatever term you want to use.
So that definitely is a factor, right? So yeah, like nobody's getting off easy in all this, right? Like the demands there are more demands, and they are more strident, and and more people are having to be exposed to them. Yeah, as a developer, you can't not care about any, like, you don't have to be an expert in it necessarily. The phrase they often use in the industry is T-shaped individuals, right? So there's a full stack engineer that's supposed to try to do everything, and then you have an I-shaped person that just knows one thing deeply. And so what we're trying to do is kind of make everybody T-shaped, to where it's like, okay, you have a deep specialty, but you have to have some understanding of these other disciplines, operations, security, whatever they are, that come together to providing the product. Because the kind of full flower of subdividing specialties, the problem is it creates local optimizations as opposed to systems thinking and optimizing the system. So it's, for a developer, like, a lot of them would prefer, it's like, hey, I just want to worry about churning out my code. Somebody else should write my tests for me. Somebody else should make sure it's secure. Somebody else should. And from their point of view, that's more
Mm-hmm.
efficient. From the organization's point of view, it's terrible. It's the least efficient.
Yeah, bananas. Yeah.
But and so there's a tension between those two things. There have been a lot of developers that, as these changes have come, like they've resented. It's like, oh, I don't want to take responsibility for what my code does in production. I don't want. It's like, well, like,
neither do I, by the way.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It's like I'm sorry, that's not really a choice anymore, right? It's like I want to just be a good developer and not do those other things. It's like, well, I'm sorry, by making that choice, you're making a choice to be a shitty developer.
Like, yeah, you have to be a good developer. Yeah,
the results that you are generating are not as useful for the organization consuming them. Like, you can have some ivory tower view of what makes you good. What really makes you good is if that is useful and helps improve the organization, right? And I think that's a keen message for InfoSec as well, right? It's like, you can have as pure a view as you want. If it cannot be efficiently consumed by an organization to make their actual products and services more secure, you're bad at your job. Like, I'm sorry. Like, it's a hard truth. None of us like it. I didn't like it when I realized that we were doing ops wrong, right? Like, that's a bitter pill to swallow, to say the way we've been doing things for a long time, it's not the best way anymore. Like, but to improve and to change, you have to be willing to embrace those bitter truths and say, okay, what then? How can we do it better, right? It's the only way that we as the human race improve, right? It's as simple as that. But it's hard. It's emotionally hard. You have to help other people through it, right? I mean, a lot of my job at National Instruments, at Bizarre Voice, I'm at my current gig, right? It's helping people through kind of, that process of understanding what it is they need to do and helping them be okay with it when it's not the thing they would do by default, right? We're in a startup and I'm doing, your standard, getting people used to Agile and stuff like that. And there's always rough edges, right? It's like, why wasn't this perfect the first time? It's like, because to make it perfect the first time, you would have had to spend several days writing a spec doc that you're not going to take time to do. And then instead we just had somebody guess at a version 1 and let you review it, because that's more efficient. It's more efficient for the organization. You don't have to spend 2 days doing something, and they're not waiting on you to generate it. And it's an end-to-end view, right, of what actually generates quality output the fastest, right? And then you have to put, to the degree that you can put your emotions aside on that, you have to do that. And then, we're all there to help each other work through it, right? As a manager, the health of my employees has always been super important to me, and people have trouble with it, right? They need help. And that's just human nature. It's not weakness. It's all of our jobs to help other folks through that part.
Yeah. Yeah. Change is always hard, right? Like, and I mean, the larger the organization, I feel like the harder that change is too. But I mean, stepping from you've seen that the number of those organizations that are like, oh, we're going to move from waterfall to agile and we're starting next week, right? And you're like, okay, it's great that you're using agile fall because you're having like 2-week sprints and you're having stand-ups, but like your whole process is still waterfall, right? And that's a great place to start. But you know, like,
I mean, changing hearts and minds is always the hardest thing. Like it's always easier. You can go into an organization and slap some Scrum on them, like, and maybe that'll help things. Maybe it won't. But the hearts and minds is always the challenge. It's how do I think about this in an agile way? I had to forward that. So back when I was at National Instruments, Agile hit the dev teams, and there wasn't an organized, like, we're going to make people be Agile, but like dev teams were just adopting it because it was new, it was cool, and it was better, right? So suddenly team 1 is Agile, suddenly team 2 is Agile. And it created a giant impedance mismatch between the way we had been interacting with the developer teams we were working with, right? We had this systems development, like, and we put a lot of work into this. So we had this whole systems development framework, right? It's like, okay, you're going to do a new thing. Let's make sure backups and security and all this and get all the questions answered and all that. But as they started to become Agile, they're like, okay, we're starting this new thing. Hey, we need to deploy to dev, next week. What can you do for us? And we're like, whoa, it's like, does not compute. But, after I sat down and engaged with it, I was like, well, it's okay, right? Like, they're not going to production with it. And, what we've been doing is kind of the idea of, we have to build out a perfect, we're building out a big, perfect, like, apartment complex and then letting everybody move in because we feel like we can't, like, it's hard to change it after that point. Right? You've got people moved in. It's hard to change it. But when the developers, like, there was a real, I think it was Karthik actually, like they sat down and explained kind of the concept of refactoring, and that it's like, hey, yes, like, we're getting started like this, but we're embracing being able to refactor and change as well. So it's okay if you build the apartment, piece by piece, and you have to go back and change the previous ones. Like, we're deliberately embracing being more adaptable, so it'll be okay, right? Because we weren't doing it because we weren't doing it that previous way because we thought it was going to be more work for us. We were doing it because we were like, well, once these guys get some of their stuff deployed, then they're never going to let us change it, right? We won't be able to go back and make it more secure or make it more hardened or make it, more resilient, or like they'll stop us because, developers don't want, they're self-absorbed and they don't want people changing stuff under them. They don't care about that, right? And so it definitely took both sides saying, hey, we have something we can give here. And then I was like, okay, well, we can just cobble you together a server that you can use for dev with the understanding that that's got to be refactored before we go in. They're like, okay, great. And so that started that kind of hand-in-hand march, right? And then when we found that SaaS team, we used that, it's like, we needed to get to market quickly, but we did some basic threat modeling and stuff like that, and then we'd do some more, and then we'd do some more, and we'd have to go back and change things. We were developing our own systems management tooling at the time. Like, we kind of made a primitive version of Terraform, I guess you would say. There was no Terraform at the time, so we wrote this thing in-house that basically did that same thing because we needed something that could deploy our systems in the cloud and the software and reason about them. It's like, this service depends on this service. We needed something that could reason about that, and that even with Chef and Puppet and stuff, that didn't really exist at the time. So we kind of developed our own. So we got real comfortable with refactoring, the systems level and the app level and the security model around it. We had to make it super secure. Like, one of the products was a FPGA compile cloud, right? And FPGA designs, like, they have some of the, hairier intellectual property that people really want to protect, right? So we're like, okay, like, this has, like, we're not going to be able to sell this product if we don't have a security first story, right? Like you know, nobody would submit their FPGA to compile in the cloud unless you know, they're convinced we know what we're doing and we have a good security story around it. But you know, getting there, you know, it's building it into it, but then it's being willing to refactor, not always having everything on the front end, right? You can't get to ship if you're also putting in your static scanner and your DAS tool and your, you know, this, that, like, you can't do all of that before you ship nowadays. Like,
no, you can't. You definitely can't. Yeah. And I mean, this is a conversation that Seth and I have with our students when we give training on secure code review. We're like, before we even talk about the ins and outs of code review, let's talk a little bit about prioritization and strategies, because here's how probably everybody makes you feel like it should be done, but in practice, it's just not, like, it's not realistic. So yeah, let's talk about what is realistic.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I have a presentation that I did it on lean monitoring back in the day, and then I adapted it to lean security later on with kind of the idea of, hey, like, identify all those areas and start off, do the most basic thing you can do in each of those areas, right? And then from there, you're going to learn what you actually need. You know, I've worked for places where, like at National Instruments in the SAS team, continuous delivery, we never did that. That wasn't a problem that was important to that particular organization. Like we could have done it, but it was like, well, that's like, it's an engineering organization. They release things kind of, you know, slowly and in line with like CD wrapped, you know, software releases. Like that wasn't the problem. We spent all of our time on systems provisioning in the cloud and like monitoring and stuff like that. Each place you work is going to be a little different. It's like, is the best place to invest there static code scanning? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. It depends what language you're using. It depends what they're doing with it. You know, some places have code scanning and it's just terrible and everybody keeps it turned off because it's not fit for that use, right? Some places have a lot of, you know, production monitoring or none, right? So, you know, embracing that kind of learning ability of lean and saying, okay, in these 6 areas, we're going to put in the bare minimum. And then immediately we're going to go back and we'll do the version 2 in the thing where we need it. And we'll have learned from having the more basic thing, right? It's like, you know, people are always like, oh, the default AWS application firewall. It's like, well, so it's better than nothing. You can set it up in 4 hours, right? And then you're learning, right? So then when you go and look to procure something more fancy and they ask you, well, what sort of threats do you see? You're not just making shit up, right? Like you have actual information, you know, God forbid, as opposed to hypothetical information, right? Like people often point at security and frankly at ops people about the FUD factor, right? It's like, well, we need this because it'll be more resilient. And they're like, yeah, I hear you saying that, but resilience, like security, is something that you can buy an infinite amount of. I mean, not really, but you can spend an infinite amount of money on it. You know, they're like, I kind of want to know, is this really addressing a need, right? Not I read something about, you know, something on the dark web. It's a theoretical threat. And it's like, okay, but like, we don't even have a IPS yet, right? You know, you have to tune that to the what's going to eliminate the bigger chunks of threats that you actually face, and actually getting data in from, you know, doing a version 1, throwing it away even for a version 2, improving on it or throwing it away for a version 3. That's the way that you get a solid foundation that gives you real security that's integrated more into the DNA of your organization, right? Because then everybody's learning along with it. They get to see it when it's simple. You know, everybody has to learn. You know, my last organization, they were trying to get some Kubernetes going. And like the problem is like that's great, but we've got a big dev team here, and like they need to be like they're not even using Docker yet. Like there's a whole learning sequence of getting used to those things that they have to go through to not use it terribly.
Yeah, I've seen a lot on Twitter recently about specifically about Kubernetes, and like there's been a whole wave of momentum towards like, yeah, you probably don't need Kubernetes, or you're probably not prepared for it, or there's probably a better alternative in the cloud computing space that you can latch onto that won't, again, if you're not prepared, like it's a better alternative for what you need and what your resources are.
Yeah.
So I've seen a lot of that recently.
Kubernetes is, I mean, it's great. So Docker is huge innovation, right? Kubernetes is a really good tool. Google, they love it at the Google scale. That's great, right? But yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, stop and ask yourself, do I, but do I need it? It's basically a big DIY platform as a service, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to put a lot of effort into that. Do you know if that effort is going to pay off? We had I won't identify it specifically, but we had a pretty major system at Alien Vault that was, it was Docker containers, deployed out, it's like we pulled from Git, built them, deployed them out to Amazon ECS. And it worked great. And we occasionally were like, well, do we need console? Do we need an operational thing? We're like, no, because we can just make a change and have a new service pushed out in 5 minutes. Like it worked super smooth. And, it's like, we could Kubernetesize that. And it's like, that translates to, we could do 3 months of work and get nothing for it is what you're telling me, right? Like we would literally be back where we are, just with a more complicated thing underneath it, right? And if you're a hobbyist, that's cool. It's like cars, right? Like some people are like, ooh, I like the, my boss Lee, right? He's always doing his own Mercedes mechanic work, right? And always launches into these long stories about, well, you see the gel-filled things. And I'm just like, okay, I have an Audi and I take it to the shop.
Just start glazing over.
Like it's cool for that to be a hobby, but like if it's not your hobby, like you want it to be done quickly and well, and like
move on. Yep.
The coolness of the interior details is not necessarily all that important to you, and I think there was a lot of enthusiasm for Kubernetes, but the hype cycle I think ran a little bit too hard. And same thing, it kind of happened for OpenStack back in the day. It was like, oh, OpenStack, you can have your own private cloud. And so places that kind of were already invested in that metaphor of, oh yeah, we're running our own data centers, whatever, like they started embracing it without thinking about, well, but should you be? Right? Like maybe you should use the real cloud instead. Like why aren't you? And a lot of times, sometimes there was a good reason, but sometimes the answer was, well, shit, we got 30 Unix admins here and they got to do something, right? and the problem is that's not sustainable. And that's so.
Tell me again about the companies getting bought because they're not performing well because of overhead.
So the QA faced that, right? QA was and some of it still is, but QA was predominantly a manual testing sort of thing. And that's gotten squeezed out. There are a lot fewer jobs for manual QA because automated testing is kind of so much better, right? In operations, there were a lot of data center monkey jobs, right? But those got squeezed out. I mean, I remember when I was at Bazaar Voice, we were moving to the cloud, but we still had some assets at Data Foundry here in town. And so I had this one systems engineer who's one of the, I'll name him Brian Dove, one of the smartest guys that I've worked with, always knew everything. Like he was he was probably the best kind of systems architect, high level guy that I had. And then once every couple months, it's like, well, I'm going to go down and spend a day at Data Foundry pulling out drives and putting in new drives. And I'm just like,
what are we doing?
Yeah, I'm just like, oh my God, like the value you bring to us in a day of doing literally anything else is so much higher. Like, I really want to just go down there and throw a Molotov into that rack, and we'll figure out something else to do, right? Like it's just, it's those inefficiencies that are just like, we can't do that, like, it's not okay, kind of trying to protect the old way of doing things it never lasts, right?
No, it's going to catch up with you at some point, and when it does, it could take the company down, right? Or it could mean you get acquired. It means that somebody else is going to cut off that lean, that fat to make it more lean. And
I mean, and that's the thing, right? A lot of folks nowadays, they find their department cut and they're being outsourced or they're being whatever, and it's like, it sucks, but like, if you've been clinging to the old way of doing things, like at some point they're going to route around you, right? Like, inefficiency is damage, and you'll be routed around if that's what has to happen for the business to make money, whatever. And so you have to embrace those higher level goals of your organization.
Yeah, well, it all goes back to the change factor that we were talking about, right? Like the jobs that we're doing nowadays didn't exist 20 years ago when we started out, right? Or however long that was. And it's all a matter of the change. Like I have this discussion with, I've got, teenagers that are in high school now. And I'm like, look, the jobs that you're going to be doing, you have to understand technology and you have to be able to talk, but like, don't get so involved in like, hey, I want to do X, right? Like I want this platform. I want this, to be able to do, computers or whatever. I'm like, as long as you understand the technology, you can move from job to job, because that's what's going to happen, like platform to platform. So
for sure.
Anyway, like we've been going for a while, so we'll probably wrap things up here. Ernest, it's been awesome to have you on and to have discussions on all the things, right? We'll have to reprise it at some point.
I hope it was helpful. Like I don't know how weird it is for this audience, because it's like, again, it's not full deep dive sec, but so much of my job has been, hey, we gotta do these security. I mean, right now I'm trying to make sure our system is up to the New York State financial cybersecurity requirements. Like that's just, everybody has to do that now. Like security and compliance and all that it is a fundamental thing that everybody knows they have to address. And if InfoSec can bring its knowledge to them in a way that they can consume and help them address that, then everybody's super happy. They love you. Everybody's won, right? And it's just a matter of kind of switching some of the approach. I mean, when I was at Alien Vault, just internally, like it's funny, like we're a security company, but it doesn't mean internally we had that on lockdown. And we went through some fairly significant iterations in our internal kind of compliance team. Initially we kind of had a team and setup that was oppositional in nature with the engineering team, right? And it didn't work out. And there's a great head of compliance there now, Karen Sipple, who like she really valued. It's like, okay, how do we really integrate this with your process? Let's learn how you're using Jira and doing work intake. Let's figure out how we can log tickets in a way that you care about, and how we can see what you're doing, and a very kind of collaborative approach. And it shifted around both the effectiveness and also kind of the human cost of doing that, right? Because it always makes your organization worse when people hate each other. Right. Like, whenever there's opposition, when there's all that, like it makes everything worse. It makes people want to work there less. It makes people enjoy their job less. And therefore it makes them less productive.
Seth and I have experienced that firsthand.
Yeah.
Along with several of our guests that have been on the show.
Yeah. If you could get everybody kind of really, enthusiastic about pulling together, getting that job done, that every once in a while you're going to hit a bad egg, right? Like sometimes this comes up in DevOps in terms of like blameless postmortems and stuff like that. And like some people roll hard on, no one is ever a bad person or wrong. And it's like, okay, usually not. Every once in a while, you're going to get somebody who's a hard case, who's just like, I hate security and I hate you because whatever, a pen tester, pen tester looked at me funny when I was young or whatever, whatever, right? Everybody's got something, right? But the vast majority of other technical professionals, like, they get it. They watch the news. They know how bad it is out there security wise. They want to make it all more secure, right? And so I'm lucky in that because I've had feet in all those different areas, I can kind of help facilitate that a little bit. But yeah, the more that whoever you are, whatever role you're filling, if you can help facilitate that collaboration, like that's the most important thing that you can do, right? Like if somebody is only half as good a pen tester, but they are twice as good at working with the engineers, that's the person I'm going to hire. Like, absolutely. Yeah. Like, I won't even think about it.
Right? Yeah. Well, I mean, security's become much more of a relationship. If you want to get security built into an organization or a product, it's more about relationships anymore than it is about the technology underneath the hood. Because, it goes back to what you're saying. Like, lean security is better than no security, right? Like, you got to start somewhere, and the guy that can talk to the developers, can talk to the engineers, or talk to the organization to make the lean portion happen, even if you're not doing it all perfectly, means that you're in a better situation and security is actually going, as opposed to somebody who wants it perfect, is going to push really hard and tell everyone no and everyone hates. And you're absolutely right. So, and we've seen that, like I've seen that over the course of my career as well. So cool. Anyway, where can people find you next, right? Like, I know we didn't talk about
DevOps days.
Yes, yeah. and DevSecOps days. So I've always kind of in line with my love for education. So you can find me and kind of James and Karthik and the other guys at theagileadmin.com. That's our blog. We've been doing that for a while. And I run Cloud Austin, a local user group here. Every May we do DevOps Days Austin. It's going to be in its 9th year or whatever. In fact, next week, y'all are going to be out of town next week. I'm going to be in Belgium next week because it's the 10th anniversary of DevOps, of DevOps Days. The first Patrick Dubois coined the term and put on DevOps Days Ghent 10 years ago. So all the organizers from the different ones are flying to Ghent for the 10th anniversary. So I'll be there, but we decided.
I was just there.
Oh, nice.
So weird. I was just a few weeks ago. It's crazy. I mean, Seth and I both traveled. Yeah, but anyways, yeah.
Outstanding. But so James, Karthik, and I decided that the time was right, and so we're running a DevSecOps Days Austin. It's actually coming up December 16th. It's going to be probably about 300 people here in Austin at the Norris Conference Center. We're looking for attendees, speakers, sponsors. It's going to be back kind of down to the like original DevOps Days was, more no frills. There's going to be one track and stuff like that. But so many people in Austin and the Austin area are really excited about bringing security together with development and operations. Right. I've talked to hardcore security people that are really intrigued. I've talked to people, in the DevOps community and stuff like that are super intrigued. So we feel like it's really a great time to bring everybody together. Of course, there's always a strong DevSecOps focus at LastCon, which is the local OWASP convention that's in November. Okay. That's great as well. But then after that, we thought we'd do kind of specifically DevSecOps Days thing. So Shannon Leitz is going to be speaking. Some others that are big names but haven't been greenlit yet, so I won't say their names. But we're looking to have some real good folks there and bring everybody together to really collaborate. That's the
there's the cat.
That's the thing that we really liked about DevOps Days is just it's not like a conference where you come and get vendor swagged and talk to, right? It's a place where you can really come and collaborate with other practitioners, like talk through stuff, right? The Austin tech community has been grabbing my first experience with restarting the OWASP chapter. It gave me a love for the technical community here, and it's so much more collaborative than a lot of other places, and I've gone to some of those meetups when I've been out for stuff in Silicon Valley, and I don't know, everybody's like, I'm not going to say anything I'm doing because you're going to steal my cool startup idea of Uber for insert noun here or whatever, right? And it's just like, whatever, dude. But here, people really love like talking to each other and figuring out these hard problems. So we're really looking forward to that. Would love for everybody to come out. So yeah, DevSecOps Days, December 16th. That's the big thing on our minds right now.
Cool. Yeah. Well, people will catch it, and we'll make sure it's linked. Ken already linked it everywhere, so we'll do that. But yeah, we appreciate your time. Appreciate the rundown. We'll have to have you back on. We can talk more maybe after DevSecOps Days, and we can talk about what went on there.
I love the podcast. I still try to keep up, with what's going on in the security world, and it's stuff like this that makes it easy to kind of put my finger on the pulse. So when I'm driving around, I'm always listening to podcasts.
I appreciate that. Thank you for joining us and for coming on. Seth, do we have anything to mention before we? We already said we were going to be in Melbourne the rest of the year, because of my lazy butt. I don't want to travel anymore for the rest of the year, so that's about it. But I don't think there's anything else. I do know we're going to order some more swag. So obviously, Ernest, we will owe you a t-shirt if we do t-shirts this time. And we're going to order some more stuff to give away for free to folks. So I don't think there's anything else. Do you have anything?
Nope. I think we're good. So we'll get back to it. But thanks everyone for joining, interacting, and find us online. Find Ernest online. We've linked to all of his social media stuffs. And we'll see everybody next week, or we'll be on set next week some point. It'll be in the future for us, but it'll be the same time for you. So there we go.
Oh, actually, there's one thing I'll mention. We have several guests coming that we worked to finally. Basically, what I'm saying is we lined them up, and I finally sent out the invites and got things going. So we've got a whole lineup of new guests. It's going to be next 2 months. They're going to be really fun. So I should have mentioned that.
Cool. Great. All right. Yep. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thanks,